If education is free, then why are there 18 million out of school children in Nigeria? This is a long video, so it will be posted on my YouTube. However, I'll be posting shorter clips here, but if you want to watch the full video, click the link in my bio to go and watch it. Imagine you're a mother, it's Monday morning and your daughter should be getting ready for school. But instead of getting ready for school, she's getting ready to go to the market to sell oranges. And it's not because you do not value education, it is because she has to earn a certain amount of money that would be used to feed the family later that night. If she goes to school, you do not get the money, right? But if she goes to the market, you get the money that will be contributed to your family's dinner. Would you still send that to school? Every time the conversation around the Nigeria out of school children crisis comes up, we usually always end with one word: poverty. But we throw that word around so casually that we've stopped to actually ask ourselves what it means. Because poverty isn't not just having money, it changes what a family can afford, it changes what they have to sacrifice, and it most definitely impacts whether a child gets an education or not. So today I am going to be showing you something that would change the way you view the Nigeria educational crisis, because poverty does not just keep children out of school, it changes the economics of education itself. And once you understand this concept, you begin to see things from an entirely different perspective. Now let's start with numbers, because numbers are very important. Nigeria has the highest number of out-of-school children, and depending on the estimate and year, we are talking about roughly 15 to 18 million children. Now, anybody that hears this number for the very first time would immediately think about how alarming this number is. However, that is not the number we're going to be paying attention to in this video. We are going to be paying attention to who these out-of-school children actually are. Now, stay with me. According to recent wealth disaggregated data, children from the poorest households are 16.3 times more likely to be out of school than children from Nigeria's richest household. I did not say 16%. I did not say as in, among the poorest household, out-of-school rates climb as high as 64%. Compare that to children from wealthier households, the difference is enormous. And this pattern does not reduce once the children are enrolled, though. No, it doesn't. Because even after they are in the classroom, wealth still determines whether they are actually learning. UNICEF found out that children from the richest household outperform children from the poorest household by around 62 percentage points in foundational reading. This same gap appears in numeracy. So you see, poverty is not only deciding whether the children get into the classrooms, it is also deciding whether they learn even after they get there. But that is not the most heartbreaking part. The World Bank found out that among Nigerian teenagers ages 15 to 19, only 38% actually completed grade 1. Among the richest household, this number goes as high as 98%. Now imagine the difference, which means that before we even start talking about secondary school, before we start talking about university, before we start talking about jobs, some children from the poorer households did not even make it past the first rung of education. Now this is where it gets interesting, because it is not just a Nigeria problem, it is a global problem. Poorer children are more likely to be out of school. However, Nigeria's wealth gap is amongst the most extreme, which tells us that this is not simply an education problem, it is a poverty problem. Which means that to understand why there are 18 million children out of school when education is free, we need to first understand how poverty works. Most people think poverty affects education in one simple way. They imagine a family says you can't pay for school fees, end of story. Except government schools in Nigeria are supposed to be free. So why are there still millions of children who are not in school? Economists have divided the cost of education into two different kinds. The first is called the direct cost. The second is called the opportunity cost. Let's start with the direct costs. If someone tells you government schools are free, technically they are right, but not entirely. Let's prepare a child for school. Imagine a child gets enrolled into a government school, which is free. However, the child needs to buy the uniform. The child Because imagine a family earns 50,000 naira a month and they're already spending 20,000 naira to enroll one child in school. Now, school might be officially free, but it has a price tag. And for many families, that price tag is simply too high for them to afford. You might be thinking, oh, direct costs is the biggest problem to education. But no, that's the fascinating part. It is not. Opportunity cost is. And let me explain. Opportunity cost asks a very specific question. What does a family lose by choosing education? Now let's go back to the mother and child we spoke about at the beginning of the video. My daughter could either go to school or she could work on the family farm. She could hawk pure water. She could help take care of her younger siblings while the adults work. In other words, her labor has value. But if she goes to school, her family loses that value. That is what economists call the opportunity cost of education. So the cost isn't really the school itself. The cost is everything the family loses by sending that child to school. And this is why child labor and education are closely connected. The Nigerian National Bureau of Statistics found that over half of Nigerian children aged 5 to 17 are involved in some sort of economic activities. Another study also found that 80% of these children are working because their parents needed that income. They are working not because their parents hate education, not because their parents do not love them, but because they need to survive. And this changes how we think about the crisis, right? These parents are not choosing between education and ignorance. They are choosing between education and eating. And this changes the entire conversation because it then shifts from here's the problem to can we actually solve this? And my goal is not to, show that the government is bad. No, that is too simplistic. My goal is to ensure people understand the systems they are in, how it works, and not just blame them, not just blame those systems. How does the system actually works? If poverty is the problem, the obvious question would be, wouldn't giving poor families more money solve this problem? Interestingly, researchers have actually, tested this, and the answer is yes, but not entirely. What do I mean by this? Nigeria introduced an initiative called the Conditional Cash Transfer Program, or CCT, and the idea was simple. Instead of giving families money with no condition attached, the government gave poorer families money with the condition that they keep their children in school, and it worked. One evaluation in Cross River State showed that children in beneficiary households were 15% more likely to stay in school, while child labor reduced. Now, this number is a very significant number because it tells us that when you reduce financial pressure on families, more children stay in school. Now, it gets more interesting because researchers also found out that even after receiving the cash transfers, many of these families still struggled because they still had to buy uniforms, they still had to buy books, they still had to, buy school materials. I remember the direct cost we spoke about the other time. Yeah. Despite the fact that they were receiving this money, it still did not eliminate those hidden costs that they had to bear. And this is why researchers recommend combining cash transfers with something else like school feeding programs. Because if a parent knows that their child would receive at least one nutritional meal from school, education then moves from something that is just costing the household to something that is actually giving back to them. And that is exactly what happened in states where feeding programs were expanded. These states reported better enrollment, better retention, and generally a higher data in the number of children in school who are actually retaining what they are being taught. But you see, school feeding alone is not enough. Cash transfers alone is not enough because poverty is not the only barrier to education. We have insecurity, we have teacher shortages, we have distance to school, we have gender norms, we have poor infrastructure, and so on and so forth. You cannot solve a systems problem with just one program. And that is one of the most important lesson I want you to take from all of this evidence that I've presented to you. So if we already know what works, why then are we not doing more of it? Which brings us to an important part in this video, education funding. Let's talk about it. UNESCO recommends that countries spend about 15 to 20% of their public expenditure on education. Nigeria doesn't. In fact, in 2025, Nigeria allocated 7.3% of its public expenditure to education. This is already below international recommendations. Then in 2026, education budget increased slightly in Naira terms. It went from 3.53 trillion naira to 3.59 trillion naira. And at first glance, it looks like, there's improvement until you take a closer look. You then notice that although the amount increased in Naira terms, the allocated percentage of the national budget for education actually fell to about 6.15%. Think about it, the budget got bigger, but education's share of that budget became smaller. And Nigeria has reportedly allocated 35 billion naira to programs addressing out of school children. Remember, we are talking about 15 to 18 million children here. So when analysts look at this number, many described it as completely disproportionate to the scale of the crisis at hand. Now, I don't say this to criticize the government for the sake of criticizing the government, because policy is already very complicated and budgets require so many trade-offs. Every ministry wants more money. Every sector claims their, issues are urgent. However, if research already tells us that interventions like school feeding, cash transfers, subsidized fees, and interventions actually work, then reducing the education budget is not just spending less money; it is reducing access in itself, and this weakens the very tools that we already see helps to keep children in school. And now suddenly the poverty problem becomes even harder to solve. Let's go back to where we first started again. The mother and her daughter trying to decide whether she goes to school or she goes to work. At first glance, this might look like a parenting decision, but after doing all this research, I do not think it is. I think it is a policy decision. Because policy would determine whether school is affordable, it would determine whether children receive meals, it will determine whether parents receive income support. It would determine whether the schools are close enough, whether the teachers are enough, and whether the classrooms are safe. So, in other words, that mother's decision did not begin that morning. It began years before. It began inside government budgets. It began inside policies. It began inside decisions that most of us would probably never see. And that is why I think conversations around education needs to change from why don't parents send their children to school to what kind of environment makes education the most expensive costs. Because until we answer that question, millions of children will continue making decisions they shouldn't have to make in the first place. And it is not going to be because they do not have dreams. It is not going to be because they do not have the potential. It is going to be because poverty creates an economical state where they just do not have the choice than to make those decisions. And until we fix that, Nigeria's out of school problem would not only be an education crisis, it would remain a poverty crisis. If you found this helpful, I would love to know what stood out to you the most, and if there are other policy issues you'd love me to break down like this, let me know in the comments.